Tournai, 1653. A construction worker digging near the church of St. Brice strikes something hard in the earth beneath him. He digs carefully now. What emerges over the following hours is not stone, not timber, not the ordinary debris of old ground. It is a gold ring, engraved on it, in careful Latin letters, are 4 words: Childeric Regis, of King Childeric. Around the ring, as the digging continues, come other things: a golden bull's head, weapons with hilts worked in gold and garnet, and scattered through the burial soil, attached to the remnants of a garment that has long since become dust. Approximately 300 small objects made of gold and deep red stone, fashioned in the shape of winged creatures, beasts, most likely, or cicadas. The distinction, across 15 centuries of burial, is difficult to make with certainty. The man in the ground has been dead since the late 5th century. He is the father of the king who baptized the Frankish world. He is the son, by tradition, of a figure whose own father was not human at all. His dynasty will govern Western Europe for 300 years. It will build the institutional foundations of what will become France, Belgium, Germany, and the broader political culture of the medieval West. And then it will be pushed so far into the background of the story that most people today know the myths invented about it before they know anything about what it actually was. Tonight we are not asking whether the legends are true. We are asking what the legends reveal about power, about memory, and about the strange and persistent human need to give the people who rule us an origin that is more than human. Settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fall away. The story begins not with a king on a throne, but with a man in the ground and 300 gold objects that traveled from a 5th century burial to a 19th century emperor's battle flags, and then disappeared into a theft that has never been solved. That is where we begin, with what the earth kept, and what the earth could not protect forever. There is a particular kind of historical invisibility that belongs only to dynasties that were pushed into the background by the people who replaced them. The Roman Empire fell and left ruins everywhere. You can stand in the middle of a Roman road in England, or look up at the Pantheon in Rome, and the weight of that civilization is physically present. The Byzantine Empire shrank and finally collapsed, but its story runs through every serious account of medieval history. Even the Mongol Empire, which governed a territory so large that its borders touched nearly every major civilization of the 13th century, has found its way into public consciousness through the name of Genghis Khan and the sheer scale of what the historical record cannot ignore. The Merovingian dynasty ruled the Frankish kingdoms of Western Europe for roughly 300 years, from the late 5th century through the mid-8th century. At their peak, Merovingian kings controlled territory that now encompasses France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Western Germany, and significant portions of Switzerland and the Netherlands. They helped bind the Frankish world to Catholic Christianity in ways that shaped the religious direction of Western Europe for centuries. They built institutions that later medieval Europe would inherit and expand. The political map of Western Europe as it existed for the next 1,000 years was, in its essential outlines, built on Merovingian foundations. And yet if you ask a reasonably educated American adult what they know about the Merovingians, you are likely to get one of 3 responses: silence, a vague memory of something called the Da Vinci Code, or a half-remembered claim about a secret bloodline. None of those responses is history. All of them are symptoms of something worth understanding. This account will work with 3 distinct layers of material, and it is worth being clear about those layers from the beginning, because confusing them is how most popular treatments of the Merovingians go wrong. The first layer is documented history, what the archaeological record shows, what the written sources from the period actually say, as opposed to what later sources claim they said. What historians who have spent careers in the archives have been able to establish with reasonable confidence, this layer is smaller than most people expect, and more complicated than most popular accounts admit. The early Merovingian period is genuinely difficult to reconstruct, because the documentary record is sparse, shaped by particular interests, and almost entirely controlled by a single tradition. The second layer is medieval myth, specifically the myths that the Merovingians and their contemporaries constructed about themselves and their origins. These myths were not accidents. They were tools, deliberately built for specific political purposes. And understanding them as tools is far more interesting than either believing them or dismissing them. A dynasty that builds a myth about its founder being born of a sea creature is not confused about biology. It is making an argument about legitimacy that the available political vocabulary required. The third layer is modern mythology. The stories that have accumulated around the Merovingians since the 18th century and accelerated dramatically in the late 20th century. Secret bloodlines, hidden churches, conspiracies stretching from ancient Jerusalem to the corridors of contemporary European power. This layer is the most visible, the most widely distributed, and the least connected to anything in the actual historical record. It will be addressed directly in this account, not to argue with it at length, but to explain where it came from, why it has been so persistent, and what it reveals about the needs it is filling. Now, the name itself, Merovingian, comes from the Latin Merovingi, which derives from the Frankish name Meroving, meaning the descendants of Merovech. Merovech, or Meroveus in Latin, is the semi-legendary founder of the dynasty. Semi-legendary is the operative word. We have no contemporary written source that describes Merovech in any detail. What we have are later accounts, written by authors who were themselves working from oral tradition, earlier written traditions that no longer survive, and the political needs of the moment in which they were writing. The first serious problem in Merovingian history is therefore the problem of sources, and it is a problem that runs all the way through everything that follows. Almost everything we know about the early Merovingians comes through a single author. His name was Gregory, and he was the Bishop of Tours from 573 until his death in 594. His Historia Francorum, the History of the Franks, is the foundational text of early Merovingian history. Without it, we would know almost nothing about the period. With it, we know quite a lot, but we know it through a particular set of eyes, shaped by a particular set of assumptions. Writing for a particular set of purposes, Gregory was not a simple propagandist. He was a genuinely learned man, a careful observer, and in many respects, a reliable chronicler of the events he witnessed directly. But he was also a bishop of the Catholic Church, writing in a Frankish kingdom whose Christian identity was, at the time of his writing, still being actively consolidated. The assumptions of his world shaped what he preserved, what he condemned, and what he simply did not think to record, because it did not fit the framework within which he understood what history was and why it mattered. Gregory is more like a very detailed and very interesting piece of stained glass than a clear window onto the Merovingian world. The light comes through, but it has been colored by the medium. The second major source problem is that the other significant accounts of the Merovingians were largely written by or under the influence of the Carolingians, the dynasty that replaced them. We will return to this at length. For now, it is enough to note that the dynasty we are studying was documented primarily by its successors, which is not a unique situation in history, but it is one that requires a particular kind of careful reading. So what do we actually know? We know that by the early 6th century, a dynasty calling itself the Merovingians controlled most of the Frankish territories of northern Gaul and had begun a process of expansion that would, within a generation, extend their power across most of what we now call France and into significant portions of Germany. We know that this dynasty produced kings who negotiated with Rome, managed the conversion of their people to Christianity, conducted wars against neighboring kingdoms, arranged dynastic marriages across the political landscape of post-Roman Europe, and built administrative structures that would outlast them by centuries. We know that they were known as the long-haired kings. We know that their founder was connected, in later tradition, to a creature of the sea. We know that they ruled not as bureaucratic administrators in the Roman style, but as sacred figures whose bodies were themselves political instruments, whose hair was a constitutional symbol, whose legitimacy was understood to flow from blood rather than office. And we know that in 751, the last Merovingian king was removed from his throne, had his head shaved, and was placed in a monastery, and that this was done with the approval of the Pope, and with the support of a family that had been building toward this moment for 3 generations. The story of how that happened, and what it meant, and why it has been pushed so far into the background of historical memory, is what we are here tonight to investigate. But first, we need to understand the world that made the Merovingians possible. We need to go back to a moment when there was no France, no Germany, no concept of Western Europe as a coherent political or cultural space. We need to go back to the forests and river valleys of a post-Roman world that was simultaneously collapsing and being rebuilt, simultaneously losing one kind of order and discovering whether it could create another. We need to go back to the people who called themselves the Franks, and ask what that word actually meant before one family decided it would mean whatever they needed it to mean. That is where the story begins. Not with a king, not with a legend, with a name that a collapsing empire put on a collection of people it could not quite categorize, and what those people eventually decided to do with it. There is a chronicle written somewhere in Burgundy in the middle of the 7th century by an author whose name we do not know. Scholars call him Fredegar, a name assigned by later researchers because no other name has survived. His chronicle is not elegant. It is the work of someone who gathered sources, copied what he found useful, and added material of his own without always making clear where one ended and the other began. In one passage of that chronicle, there is a story about the mother of Merovech. The story goes like this. The wife of a Frankish king named Clodio went to the sea to bathe. In the water, she encountered a creature. Fredegar calls it a beast of Neptune, a quinotaur, something that was part bull and part sea creature. The encounter resulted in a pregnancy, and the child, born from that pregnancy, or born at some ambiguous intersection of that encounter and the king's own fatherhood, was Merovech, the founder of the Merovingian line. This is the entire surviving account of the founding myth of a dynasty that ruled Western Europe for 300 years. One passage, one anonymous chronicle, written perhaps 2 centuries after the events it claims to describe. The temptation when encountering a story like this is to do one of 2 things. The first is to take it as evidence of something literal, which is what certain modern interpreters have done, spinning the quinotaur into encoded genetic secrets or proof of supernatural bloodlines. The second is to dismiss it as obvious nonsense and move on to something more serious. Both responses miss the point entirely. The question worth asking about a founding myth is never whether it is factually true. The question is what work it was designed to do. And to understand what work this myth was doing, you need to understand the political world in which it appeared and for which it was constructed. The 7th century Frankish world was a world in which legitimacy was everything and paperwork was nothing. There were no constitutions. There were no formal mechanisms for establishing who had the right to rule. There was tradition. There was military power. There was the accumulated weight of custom. And there was the claim of blood. In such a world, the question of where a ruling family came from was not a question about biography. It was a question about authority. Every major political tradition of the ancient Mediterranean world had solved this problem the same way. Roman emperors claimed descent from gods. Greek heroes were sons of Zeus or Poseidon. The kings of Israel were anointed by a god whose relationship to them was personal and exclusive. The pharaohs of Egypt were themselves divine. The pattern was not a coincidence. It was a solution to a structural problem. If your authority comes from blood, and blood alone, then the blood must come from somewhere that cannot be questioned. And the only source that cannot ultimately be questioned is one that lies outside the human world entirely. The Quinotaur does exactly this job. Notice what kind of creature it is. Not a god of war, which would make obvious sense for a dynasty of Frankish warriors. Not a sky deity, which would connect the Merovingians to the Roman imperial tradition they were partially inheriting. A sea creature, something that lives in the boundary space between the known world and the unknown, something that cannot be followed, cannot be verified, cannot be cross-examined. The sea in the early medieval imagination was not simply water. It was the edge of the comprehensible world. The ocean was where maps ran out. To say that your founder's bloodline entered through the sea was to say that it entered through the place where human accounting stopped. No one could go there and check. No rival family could produce a document disputing the claim, because the claim was made in a register that documents could not reach. This is sophisticated political thinking. Even if it does not look like it from the outside, there is a further layer worth noting. The story as Fredegar tells it is deliberately ambiguous about the paternity of Merovech. The child may have been the son of the Frankish king Clodio. He may have been the son of the sea creature. Or he may have been somehow both. A product of two encounters whose precise relationship the text does not resolve. Scholars of early medieval narrative have noted that this ambiguity is probably not accidental. A Merovingian king who was entirely human was a king whose legitimacy could be compared to other humans. A Merovingian king who was entirely supernatural was a king whose story belonged to the realm of pure myth and might be harder to connect to practical politics. A Merovingian king who was both occupied a different kind of political space, one that was immune to a certain kind of challenge. Now it is worth being honest about something. We do not know when this myth was created. We do not know whether it was created by the Merovingians themselves, by their supporters, or by someone else working in their tradition. Fredegar is our only source. And Fredegar was writing in the mid-7th century, roughly 200 years after the period in which Merovech is supposed to have lived. The myth may be very old. It may have been assembled relatively recently before Fredegar recorded it. The evidence does not allow us to be certain. What the evidence does allow us to observe is the context in which the myth appears in writing. By the time Fredegar is composing his chronicle, the Merovingian dynasty is approximately 200 years into its rule. It is also beginning to show signs of the internal strain that will, within a century, end it entirely. The question of what makes a Merovingian king uniquely legitimate, uniquely irreplaceable, is becoming more than an abstract philosophical question. A myth that says the Merovingian bloodline entered the world through a gateway that no human could access or duplicate was, in that context, a political argument. It was saying, you cannot replace these kings, because whatever they carry in their blood, you cannot manufacture it. You cannot inherit it by conquest. You cannot acquire it by appointment. It came from somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary human arrangements. And it can only pass through the bodies of those who already have it. The Carolingians, who would eventually replace the Merovingians, understood this argument perfectly. They understood it because they had to find a counter-argument powerful enough to overcome it. The counter-argument they found was not biological. It was ecclesiastical. And we will examine that counter-argument in detail when we reach 751. But before leaving this story entirely, there is one more thing worth observing. The Frankish kingdoms of the 7th century were Christian kingdoms. The church was a central institution of political life, and yet this myth, which circulated in this Christian political world, is not a Christian myth. It has no saints, no divine providence, no scriptural precedent. It reaches back past the Christian world entirely into something older, something that the pre-Christian cultures of the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean had in common: the belief that the boundary between the human world and the world beneath the water was a place where extraordinary things could happen, and where ordinary rules did not apply. That this myth survived and was written down in a Christian chronicle in the Christian 7th century tells us something about how deep the roots of Merovingian identity ran, and how far beyond the surface of official religion a dynasty's claim to uniqueness could extend. The Quinator was never meant to be believed in the way a historical fact is believed. It was meant to be felt, to create a sensation of difference, of distance, of something in the Merovingian bloodline that set it apart from any other family that might seek to claim what they had built. There is a moment in the year 358 that tells us more about the origins of the Merovingian world than almost any chronicle written afterward. The Roman Emperor Constantius II is dealing with a problem on the Rhine frontier. A collection of Germanic peoples have been raiding and settling in Roman provincial territory, moving across the river in patterns that the imperial frontier system was designed to prevent. The emperor cannot simply destroy them. He needs the frontier managed. He needs bodies on the land. He needs men who will defend the border in exchange for the right to stay inside it. So he makes a deal. He grants a group of these peoples the right to settle as federates, as allied peoples within Roman territory, in a province called Toxandria, corresponding roughly to what is now the southern Netherlands and northern Belgium. The document recording this arrangement uses a word to describe the peoples being settled: Franci, the Franks. This is one of the earliest surviving uses of that name in a Roman administrative context, and it is worth pausing on what the name meant at the moment it was written down. The Franci of the 4th century were not a single tribe with a single origin, a single language, a single set of customs, and a shared sense of themselves as distinct from everyone around them. They were a loose grouping of Germanic peoples living along and across the Rhine frontier who were similar enough in their general way of life to be placed under a single administrative label. The label came from the outside, from the bureaucratic machinery of an empire that needed to put names on things in order to manage them. Whether the people it described would have recognized themselves in it is a question the evidence does not clearly answer. This matters deeply for understanding the Merovingians, because the Merovingians were not, in their origins, the leaders of a unified and ancient Frankish nation. They were a single family, almost certainly of Salian Frankish origin, who over several generations in the late 5th and early 6th century managed to consolidate power over a population that was itself diverse, recently settled, and still in the process of developing a coherent identity. The Franks of this period came in two broad groupings: the Salian Franks, whose name may derive from the Sala River or from an older word suggesting a maritime connection, lived primarily in the lower Rhine region and coastal territories. These were the Franks most closely associated with the Merovingian family. The Ripuarian Franks, whose name comes from the Latin ripa, meaning riverbank, lived further upstream along the Rhine, in what is now western Germany. Bringing both groups under a single Merovingian authority required military force, strategic marriage, and considerable political patience across multiple generations. The territory that the Merovingians would eventually come to rule was not empty, and it was not simple. In the south and west, the population was largely Gallo-Roman, descended from the inhabitants of the Roman province of Gaul, speaking a form of Latin that was slowly evolving toward what would eventually become French, and organized around the cities and ecclesiastical structures that Roman administration had left behind. In the northeast, the populations were Germanic, In the northwest, Celtic traditions persisted. The Visigoths controlled a large kingdom in the southwest. The Burgundians had established their own kingdom in the southeast. And at the center of all this complexity, hanging over every arrangement and every calculation, was the fact of what had happened to Rome. The Western Roman Empire had ceased to function as a political entity. The last emperor of the West, a young man named Romulus, had been deposed in 476 by a Germanic warlord named Odoacer. The date is famous, but the reality was less dramatic than the date suggests. The empire had been collapsing for decades before 476, and its formal end changed less on the ground than its symbolic weight implies. The Roman roads remained. The cities continued. Reduced, but not abandoned. The church persisted. The Latin language held. What was gone was the unifying political authority, the single center from which power radiated. Into that absence came a generation of leaders who had to figure out how to build something new from the materials the Roman world had left behind. The Merovingian family's original power base was in the territory between the Somme and the Scheldt rivers, in what Romans had called Belgica Secunda, dense forests, marshy lowlands, river systems that served as barriers and highways simultaneously. A frontier landscape that had lived for generations at the edge of the Roman world without ever being fully absorbed by it. Not a glamorous starting point, but a defensible one, and a productive one, of the kind of warriors and leaders that frontier conditions tend to produce. From this base, the Merovingian family built outward. The process was gradual, violent, and punctuated by setbacks. There were assassinations within the family. There were military defeats. There were moments when the entire enterprise might have collapsed and the family disappeared into the anonymity of the post-Roman Germanic aristocracy. And at the center of this story, or rather at its origins, is a figure who almost completely eludes us. His name, as tradition gave it, is Merovech. The dynasty bears his name, and yet Merovech himself is one of the most historically elusive figures in the entire early medieval period. We have no contemporary written source that describes him. We have the name, preserved in the dynasty's own designation of itself, and we have the myth that Fredegar recorded 2 centuries after the period in which Merovech is supposed to have lived. This is not entirely unusual for this period. The documentary record of 5th century Western Europe is extremely thin. The absence of documentation does not prove the absence of the person. But it does mean that everything we say about Merovech is filtered through layers of tradition, interpretation, and retrospective myth-making that make it very difficult to separate the historical kernel from the political overlay. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that by the reign of Merovech's son, Childeric I, the Merovingian family had established a real and documented political presence in the Frankish territories. Childeric is not a mythological figure. He left behind a tomb, the man in the ground at Tournai. The man whose ring we found at the beginning of this account is the bridge between the legend and the history, between the sea creature and the historical dynasty, between the myth and the kingdom, and his son, Clovis, would make a single decision that turned that kingdom into something the Roman world had not anticipated and that the medieval world could not escape. That decision was made on a winter night in the city of Reims, and it changed everything. There is a moment in the winter of 496 that Gregory of Tours describes with the kind of careful attention that a bishop reserves for events he believes were touched by something beyond ordinary human causation. A Frankish king is standing in a baptistery in the city of Reims. Around him are his warriors, who have agreed to be baptized alongside their lord. The bishop performing the ceremony is a man named Remigius, later Saint Remigius, who, according to Gregory, addressed the king with words that have echoed across 15 centuries. Bow your head, proud Sicambrian. Worship what you have burned. Burn what you have worshipped. The king's name was Clovis. He was the son of Childeric I, the man in the Tournai tome, and the grandson, by tradition, of Merovech himself. He had been king of the Salian Franks since approximately 481, inheriting his position at around the age of 15. In the 15 years between his accession and that winter night in Reims, he had transformed the Merovingian position from a regional power in the northern Frankish territories into the dominant military force in Gaul. And on that winter night, he made a decision that would have consequences reaching well beyond anything a single military victory could have produced. The decision was not simply to become a Christian. Christianity had been spreading through the Germanic kingdoms of post-Roman Europe for several generations by the time Clovis made his choice, and a significant number of Germanic rulers were already Christian. The Visigoths, who controlled the large kingdom to his south, were Christian. The Burgundians, to his southeast, were Christian. The Ostrogoths, under Theodoric, who dominated Italy, were Christian. The decision that mattered was which kind of Christian to become: the Christianity practiced by the Visigoths, the Burgundians, and the Ostrogoths was Arian Christianity. Arianism held a different understanding of the relationship between God the Father and Jesus the Son than the position that had become Orthodox Catholic teaching. The Council of Nicaea, in 325, had condemned Arianism as heresy. But the condemnation had not prevented it from spreading widely among the Germanic peoples who had converted during the 4th and 5th centuries. For the Pope in Rome and the bishops of the Catholic Church, Arian Christian rulers were not legitimate defenders of the true faith. They could be accommodated, but they could not be given what Catholic rulers received: the full institutional endorsement of the Church, the religious legitimacy that Rome could bestow, the ability to present expansion as something sanctioned by God rather than merely by military force. When Clovis chose to be baptized in the Catholic tradition, he was aligning the Merovingian dynasty with the only supranational institution in post-Roman Western Europe that still commanded loyalty across ethnic and political boundaries. He was giving himself something that the Visigoth king and the Burgundian king and the Ostrogoth king did not have: a partner whose authority was recognized by the Gallo-Roman population of the territories he was about to expand into. The Gallo-Roman population of Gaul was the majority population of the territory the Merovingians were building their kingdom in. They were Latin-speaking. They were Catholic. Their bishops were the most educated men in their communities, the administrators who kept records, the intermediaries between populations and power. By becoming Catholic, Clovis became the ruler that the Gallo-Roman bishops could support publicly and enthusiastically. Within 5 years of the baptism at Reims, Clovis had defeated the Visigoth kingdom at the Battle of Vui in 507, killing the Visigoth king Alaric II. The Visigoth kingdom, which had seemed the dominant power in the western part of the old Roman world, collapsed with remarkable speed. The Gallo-Roman population of the former Visigoth territories did not resist the Frankish takeover with anything like the energy they might have brought to resisting a fellow Arian ruler. The Catholic bishops of those territories were, in many cases, actively cooperative. This is one of the most important mechanisms in early medieval European history, and it is one that general accounts tend to underplay, because it is less dramatic than battlefield descriptions. The support of the Catholic Church was not merely a moral endorsement. It was a practical administrative advantage of the First Order. The Church controlled literacy, record-keeping, institutional memory, and moral authority in local communities across the territory the Merovingians were expanding into. A ruler who had the Church on his side had access to all of that. The Franks under Clovis did not have to build that infrastructure from scratch. They inherited it, because they had made themselves the kind of rulers the Church could endorse. It would be an oversimplification to say that everything that followed in Western European history traces directly back to that winter night in Reims. History is never that clean, and single events rarely serve as the sole cause of the large patterns that follow them. But it is accurate to say that the Catholic identity of the Frankish kingdom that Clovis built was one of the most consequential inheritances of early medieval Europe, and that this inheritance shaped the relationship between political and religious authority in the West in ways that remained significant for many centuries afterward. What is equally important, and equally easy to miss, is what Clovis did not do after the conversion. He did not become Roman. He did not attempt to reconstruct Roman administrative forms or present himself as a successor to Roman imperial authority in any formal sense. He remained a Frankish king, whose legitimacy rested on his blood, his military prowess, and his ability to hold the loyalty of a warrior aristocracy that understood power in Germanic terms. The conversion added a new layer of legitimacy without replacing the existing one. Clovis was simultaneously the Catholic king endorsed by the Pope and the Frankish warlord descended from Merovech and the sea creature. This layering of legitimacy, the deliberate accumulation of different kinds of authority that spoke to different audiences, is one of the most interesting features of Merovingian kingship. The Merovingians were, at their best, extraordinarily skilled at being different things to different people simultaneously, speaking the language of Roman Christianity to their bishops and the language of Frankish tradition to their warriors. Clovis died in 511. In the year before his death, he convened the Council of Orleans, the first major ecclesiastical council held in the Frankish kingdom, at which bishops from across his territory gathered to establish church law and ecclesiastical organization under royal patronage. He was building the institutional framework within which his dynasty would operate, creating the partnership between royal and ecclesiastical authority that would define Merovingian governance for the next century and a half. He had been king for 30 years. He had unified the Frankish territories, defeated the Visigoths, established a capital at Paris, and built a political structure that would outlast him by 2.5 centuries. He was not yet 45 years old when he died. The dynasty he left behind was, at that moment, the most powerful political force in post-Roman Western Europe. What happened next, and why it eventually went wrong, is a story that begins not with military defeat or political miscalculation, but with a symbol worn on the bodies of every Merovingian king who ever sat on a throne, a symbol that was simultaneously a constitutional provision, a spiritual claim, and the most elegant political vulnerability any ruling dynasty has ever built into itself. At some point in the early 6th century, a Merovingian king named Childeric and his son were captured by Clovis I after a military defeat. Clovis did not kill them immediately. Instead, he had their long hair cut short, and then had them ordained as clergy. Childeric as a priest and his son as a deacon, according to Gregory of Tours. Childeric wept when he saw what had been done to him and his son, and said that the leaves had been cut from a green tree, but the roots were still alive and would grow again. Clovis, who understood exactly what this meant, had them both killed. This small, brutal episode tells us more about the nature of Merovingian kingship than almost any formal document from the period. It tells us that the long hair of a Merovingian king was not an aesthetic preference. It was not a fashion choice. It was the physical mark of royal status, the visible sign of a legitimacy that resided in the body itself, and cutting it was an act of constitutional significance that everyone in the Frankish world understood immediately and completely. The Merovingians were called the reges criniti, the long-haired kings. The designation appears in multiple sources across the entire span of the dynasty, and it is not used as description in the way you might describe a king as tall or broad-shouldered. It is used as a title, as a defining characteristic, as the thing that marked these particular kings as different from every other kind of ruler in the post-Roman world. To understand why hair carried this weight, You need to understand how the Frankish world understood the relationship between the body and power. In the Roman tradition, power was an office. An emperor was an emperor because he held a position in an institutional structure that had rules for how the position was acquired, held, and transferred. The body of the emperor mattered, but it mattered instrumentally. The office was primary. The Frankish tradition worked differently. In the Germanic world from which the Franks emerged, power was understood as something carried in the blood and expressed through the body. A king was a king because of what he was, not because of what position he occupied. His authority was an expression of an inner quality, a special nature that distinguished him from other men, that was present in his body as a physical reality, not merely as a legal status. The long hair of the Merovingian kings was the visible expression of this inner quality. It said this person carries something in his blood that other people do not carry. And you can see it here, in the length and weight of his hair. This created a political system of remarkable elegance and remarkable rigidity. The elegance was this: no document was required to establish legitimacy. No election. No appointment. No formal ceremony of succession was necessary in the same way it would be in a bureaucratic system. A man with long Merovingian hair, descended from the right bloodline, was a legitimate king by virtue of what his body contained. The legitimacy was self-evident. It was present to the senses. The rigidity was this: you could not manufacture Merovingian legitimacy. You could not acquire it by conquest. You could not bestow it by appointment. It was either in the blood or it was not. And if it was in the blood, it was in the hair. And if you cut the hair, you had made a statement about the blood that everyone could read. Gregory of Tours records multiple episodes in which hair-cutting functions as a political instrument of the highest consequence. The case of Childeric is one. There are others. When Merovingian queens sought to protect their children from rivals, one of the most urgent questions was whether the rivals would cut the children's hair. Because cutting the hair of a royal child was understood as a statement that the child was no longer in the line of royal succession. In one particularly striking episode recorded by Gregory, the Queen Clotilda, grandmother of the young princes she was trying to protect, he was given a choice by their enemies. The boys could have their hair cut, or they could be killed. She chose death over the cutting of their hair. This is not the behavior of a woman attached to a fashion preference. This is the behavior of a woman who understood that her grandsons with cut hair were, in the political world she inhabited, already dead in the ways that mattered. The theological dimension of this practice is worth exploring. Because the Merovingians operated in a world where Christian symbolism and pre-Christian Frankish tradition were constantly in dialogue. The most obvious biblical parallel is the story of Samson, which the Frankish aristocracy would have known through the church's regular engagement with the Old Testament. Samson's strength resided in his hair. When Delilah cut it, he lost not merely a physical attribute, but the divine gift that made him what he was. The parallel between Samson's hair and the Merovingian king's hair was not lost on the people of the 6th and 7th centuries. A Merovingian king whose hair was cut was a king from whom God's gift had been taken. In the same way that Samson's strength had been taken, the imagery translated across the theological boundary with a neatness that the church could accommodate and that the Frankish tradition could recognize. The pre-Christian roots deserve attention as well. In the Germanic warrior cultures of the pre-Christian period, long hair was associated with the special status of the warrior who still carried the power and intensity of the battlefield in his person. The general cultural logic, the idea that something essential about a warrior's power and status was expressed through and in the hair, was present in the cultural inheritance from which Merovingian practice drew. What the Merovingians did was concentrate this diffuse cultural logic onto the royal bloodline specifically. The long, uncut hair was a royal distinction, the specific mark of the specific family. not a general aristocratic custom. This concentration meant that the visible mark of royal legitimacy was unique to the Merovingian family. It could not be imitated by other families without making a claim that everyone would recognize as a claim. It was a monopoly on a symbol, and like all effective monopolies, it shaped the entire market around it. And this is why the event of 751, which we will reach in the chapter on the end of the dynasty, was designed the way it was designed. When Childeric III, the last Merovingian king, was removed from the throne by the Carolingian family with the approval of Pope Zachary. The act of removal was not a battle. It was not an execution. It was a haircut. The last Merovingian king was placed in a monastery with his head shaved. And the 300-year reign of his dynasty was over. The people who did this had learned the symbolic grammar from the Merovingians themselves. They had watched, across 3 generations, how the Merovingians used haircutting as a political instrument. They had learned that the symbol could accomplish what violence left incomplete. Because violence could be reversed, but symbolic destruction had a finality that physical force alone could not achieve. They had learned the lesson. They applied it to the people who had taught it. We will return to that moment. But to understand it fully, we need to understand first what the dynasty produced at its height. We need to look at the Merovingian world when it was working as its architects intended, and at 2 figures whose rivalry defines the dynasty's most turbulent and most human chapter. Their names were Brunhild and Fredegar, and the war they fought across 4 decades was not simply a story of personal hatred. It was a demonstration of what Merovingian power actually looked like when it was fully unleashed, without the constraints that later tradition preferred to remember. In the year 567, a Visigoth princess named Brunhild arrived in the Frankish kingdom of Austrasia to marry the Merovingian king Sigebert I. She was educated, politically sophisticated, and accustomed to a court culture that the rougher edges of Frankish aristocratic life had not yet fully developed. Contemporary sources, even the ones that would later turn against her, describe her as unusually capable. In the same year, a woman of obscure origin named Fredegund entered the court of the Neustrian king Childeric I. How she arrived there, and what she was before she arrived, the sources do not agree on. What the sources do agree on is what happened next. Childeric put aside his existing wife, a Visigoth princess named Galswintha, who happened to be Brunhild's sister, and took Fredegund as his queen. Galswintha was found strangled in her bed shortly afterward. What followed was one of the most destructive conflicts in Merovingian history, and one of the most revealing. The war between Brunhild and Fredegund lasted, in various forms, across 4 decades, and outlasted both of the kings whose marriages had set it in motion. It consumed the energies of the divided Frankish kingdoms, produced assassinations and counter-assassinations at the highest levels of power, shaped the political alignments of the late 6th century in ways that historians have been tracing ever since, and ended only with the death of one of the 2 women, not peacefully, but before following the war itself. It is worth understanding what these 2 women reveal about how Merovingian power actually worked. The standard account of early medieval women assigns them a largely passive role, as objects of diplomatic marriage, as mothers of heirs, as figures whose significance derives from their relationships to male rulers, rather than from their own exercise of agency. The actual record of the Merovingian period is considerably more complicated than this standard account suggests. Brunhild governed Austrasia as regent, first for her son Childebert II, after the assassination of Sigebert I in 575, and then for her grandsons after Childebert's death. She maintained diplomatic correspondence with the Byzantine emperor and with Pope Gregory I. She managed the complex politics of a divided Frankish world with a strategic intelligence that even hostile sources cannot quite conceal behind their disapproval. Pope Gregory I, writing to Brunhild in the late 6th century, addressed her in terms that made clear he regarded her as a genuine political partner, capable of advancing the Church's interests in the Frankish world in ways that depended on her own power and judgment rather than on any male intermediary. The correspondence between Brunhild and Gregory is one of the most extraordinary documentary survivals of the period, and it shows a woman operating at the highest level of early medieval political life with a confidence and a competence that the later tradition, which was not friendly to her memory, could not entirely suppress. Fredegund operated differently. Where Brunhild worked through the structures of regency and diplomatic correspondence, Fredegund worked through a more direct and considerably more ruthless application of the instruments available to her. The sources attribute to her a series of assassination attempts, some successful and some not, directed against enemies, rivals, and at least one of her own children who threatened her position. Whether all of these attributions are accurate is impossible to determine, partly because many of the sources that describe her were written from positions hostile to her and to the Neustrian court she dominated. What is not in serious dispute is that Fredegund survived in a political environment that was lethal to people who could not protect themselves, and that she survived it through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and the effective management of the political relationships available to her. She outlasted the assassination of her husband Childeric in 584, governed as regent for her young son, Clotaire II, and died peacefully in approximately 597, having outlasted most of her enemies. The conflict between these two women was not simply personal, though the personal element was real. It was a conflict between the two halves of the divided Frankish kingdom, Austrasia in the east and Neustria in the west, whose distinct aristocracies, distinct political cultures, and distinct economic interests made them natural rivals in the competition for dominance over the Frankish world as a whole. Brunhild and Fredegund were the human faces of an institutional tension that would have existed regardless of the personal histories of the women who happened to embody it. But the institutional tension was real, and the way it played out through the careers of these two women illustrates something important about the nature of the Merovingian political order at its most characteristic. The Merovingian system concentrated legitimacy in the blood of a single family, but it did not concentrate power in a single institution or a single office. Power in the Merovingian world was distributed across the royal family, the aristocracy, the church, and the increasingly important officials who managed the practical administration of the divided kingdoms. In a system structured this way, the space for individuals with intelligence, determination, and the right positioning to accumulate and exercise real power was considerable. Brunhild and Fredegund filled that space. The end of Brunhild came in 613, when the Frankish kingdoms were finally reunified under her great-grandson's rival, Clotaire II, who was Fredegund's son. Brunhild was captured, tried for a series of crimes, including the deaths of 10 Frankish kings, and executed. The method of her execution, being torn apart by horses, was unusual enough to be recorded by multiple sources, and it speaks to the intensity of the feelings her career had generated among the Frankish aristocracy she had spent 4 decades managing. Whether the charges against her were accurate is a question the sources do not allow us to resolve with confidence. The trial was conducted by the man who had defeated her, and the verdict served his political needs. What we can say is that the image of Brunhild in the sources is shaped by the tradition that preserved those sources, a tradition that had reasons to make her the villain of the story. Gregory of Tours, who died in 594, before the end of the conflict, wrote about both women with the complex mixture of moral judgment and political realism that characterizes his work at its best. He disapproved of much of what they did. He could not pretend they were not consequential. The Carolingian sources that followed were less ambivalent. Brunhild became, in the tradition that shaped subsequent historical memory, a figure of almost theatrical wickedness. Fredegund was treated with somewhat more complexity, partly because her son, Clotaire II, was the king whose reign represented the last effective Merovingian reunification before the dynasty's decline. Both women have been, in the centuries since, alternately condemned and rehabilitated by historians, whose own moments have shaped what they needed to find in the record. A 19th-century tradition found in Brunhild a romantic heroine, a 20th-century tradition found in both women evidence of female agency in a world that supposedly denied it. The 21st-century scholarship represented by historians including Pauline Stafford and Janet Nelson has tried to read them with more careful attention to what the sources actually say and what the sources cannot reliably tell us. What the sources can tell us, even filtered through their various distortions, is that the Merovingian political order produced women who governed kingdoms, managed wars, conducted diplomacy, and shaped the trajectory of Frankish history across decades. This was not an accident of personality. It was a feature of a system that concentrated legitimacy in blood rather than in office, and that therefore created, in the spaces around the holders of royal blood, room for capable individuals to exercise power that a more rigidly institutional system might have closed off. The chaos that the rivalry of Brunhild and Fredegund produced, the decades of war and assassination and political instability that followed from the murder of Galswintha, also had structural consequences that would prove fatal to the dynasty in the long run. The Frankish inheritance system, which divided the kingdom among male heirs at each royal death, had been producing endemic instability since the death of Clovis I. The conflicts of the late 6th and early 7th century, shaped in part by the rivalry of the two queens, accelerated the process by which powerful aristocratic families entrenched their regional positions and accumulated the kind of local authority that was difficult for any central royal power to challenge. The men who would eventually become the Carolingians were building their position in exactly this environment. They were learning, from the chaos of the late Merovingian period, what it would take to replace a system that was producing instability rather than order. And they were learning, from women like Brunhild, how much could be accomplished by someone with the right positioning, the right relationships, and the patience to work within the structures of the existing system, while gradually transforming those structures into something else. The lesson they eventually applied was a version of the lesson those queens had taught. We began this account with the moment of discovery. The construction worker in Tournai in 1653, the ring with the words Childeric Regis, the 300 winged objects scattered through the burial soil. Now it is time to go back to that grave and stay with it. Because what was in the ground at Tournai is not just an archaeological curiosity. It is one of the most consequential finds in the history of European cultural symbolism, and the story of what happened to those objects in the 12 centuries between their burial and their discovery, and in the 2 centuries between their discovery and their partial disappearance, is a story about how power borrows its symbols and what happens when those symbols are lost. Childeric I died around 481 or 482. He was the king of the Salian Franks, the father of Clovis I, and, by the genealogy the dynasty had constructed for itself, the son of Merovech and therefore the grandson, at one remove, of the sea creature whose existence could not be verified and whose political usefulness was therefore inexhaustible. His burial was not a Christian burial. Childeric died before Clovis converted the Frankish world to Catholic Christianity, and what was placed in the ground with him reflected the religious world of the pre-Christian Frankish aristocracy. A horse sacrifice was associated with the burial. The objects follow the patterns of Germanic warrior elite burials, with weapons and personal ornaments and symbols of status, rather than the Christian symbols that would become standard in later Merovingian royal burials. The man in the ground was a Frankish king of the old type. The weapons found in the grave were not crude iron tools. The sword had a hilt worked in gold and garnet in the cloisonné technique that represented the highest level of Frankish metalworking skill. It was a weapon that was also an object of art, a demonstration that its owner commanded resources and craft traditions of real sophistication. The gold ring engraved with Childeric I is the object that anchors everything else in the grave to a specific historical identity. Without the ring, the burial might be attributed to any wealthy Frankish aristocrat of the period. With the ring, it becomes the grave of a known historical figure, the father of the king who changed the political direction of the Western world. The ring is a seal ring, used to authenticate documents by pressing it into wax. Its existence tells us that Childeric was operating in a world in which written authentication mattered, in which the administrative practices of Roman governance had not simply vanished with the empire, but had been partially absorbed into the practice of Frankish kingship. And then there are the winged objects, approximately 300 of them, made of gold and deep red garnet, fashioned in the shape of winged insects. Their identification has been debated since the moment of discovery. Most contemporary scholars who have examined them, or the documentation of them, describe them as stylized representations of bees or cicadas. The garnet work is cloisonné, the same technique visible in the sword hilt, executed at a level of precision that required considerable specialist skill. They were sewn onto a garment, most likely a ceremonial cloak or mantle, in a pattern that covered the fabric. When Childeric was buried, he was buried wearing the symbols of his royal identity, worked in gold and precious stone, as though the objects on the surface of his body would continue to express what he had been after the body itself could no longer express anything at all. The discovery of the grave in 1653 was immediately recognized as extraordinary. A detailed account was published by Jean-Jacques Chifflet, a physician, in 1655, with careful engravings of the objects. This publication became the primary record through which the scholarly world knew the Childeric treasure for the next century and a half. In 1767, the objects were transferred from Vienna to the Royal Library in Paris as part of a diplomatic gift. They were placed in the Cabinet des Médailles, where they remained accessible to scholars and to visitors of sufficient distinction for the next several decades. Among those who studied them carefully was a young man from Corsica with extraordinary ambitions and a keen interest in the symbols through which power communicated itself. Napoleon Bonaparte was crowned Emperor of the French in December of 1804. In a ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral staged with a grandeur designed to communicate the nature and sources of the authority being claimed. For that ceremony, and for the imperial court that followed it, Napoleon needed symbols. He needed symbols that communicated a legitimacy deeper and older than the revolutionary period that had brought him to power, deeper and older than the Bourbon monarchy that had preceded the revolution. The Bourbon monarchy had used the fleur-de-lis as its primary heraldic symbol. Adopting the fleur-de-lis would have connected Napoleon to the Bourbon line. He was, in some sense, replacing. That was not the connection he wanted. Instead, Napoleon chose the bee, the golden bees from Childeric's tomb. Documented in Chifflet's publication and physically present in the Cabinet des Médailles, became the heraldic symbol of the Napoleonic Empire. They appeared on the imperial mantle. They appeared on official documents and decorations. They appeared on the furnishings of the imperial palaces. The bee became the signature of the new empire, recognizable across Europe as the mark of Napoleonic authority. The choice was deliberate and informed. Napoleon was reaching back past the Bourbons, past the medieval French monarchy, past Charlemagne and the Carolingians. to the earliest stratum of Frankish royal identity he could access. He was saying, in the visual language of heraldry, that his authority was not derived from the kings who had immediately preceded him. It was connected to something older, something that predated the dynasty that the revolution had just interrupted. The Merovingian bees gave Napoleon what he needed, a claim to historical depth that bypassed the dynasty he was replacing. He was not restoring a throne. He was reaching back to the foundations. This is the same logic that had motivated the Merovingians themselves when they built the myth of Merovech and the sea creature. The logic that says my legitimacy does not come from the immediate human world of rival claims and political contest. It comes from something that goes deeper than any of that. In April of 1831, thieves broke into the Cabinet des Médailles and stole a significant portion of the Childeric collection. The theft was discovered quickly. Some objects were recovered from the Seine, where the thieves had disposed of them after apparently attempting to melt them down, but the recovery was incomplete. The majority of the golden bees, the most symbolically charged objects in the entire collection, were never found. What remains is the documentation. Chiflets engravings of 1655, the scholarly accounts that followed. The two surviving bees now held in the collections of the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and the knowledge of what was there, preserved in images and descriptions, allowing us to understand what was lost even as the objects themselves are gone. The story of Childeric's tomb is, among other things, a story about the persistence of royal symbols across time. Objects buried with a pagan Frankish king in the late 5th century were studied by a French emperor 13 centuries later and used to construct a new imperial identity. The symbols that meant power in one world were recognized as meaning power in another world, so different from the original that they shared almost nothing except the human need to reach backward for a legitimacy that the present could not provide on its own. The same dynamic runs through the entire history of the Merovingians and their afterlife. A dynasty that built its legitimacy on things that could not be manufactured or transferred, and then found that those same things could not protect it when the people it had built them against found a different kind of legitimacy to put in their place. The gold bees are gone. The ring survives in documentation, if not entirely in original. The man in the grave has been dead for 15 centuries, and yet the symbol he was buried with shaped the visual identity of a European empire 14 centuries after his death. That is a particular kind of power. Not political power. Not military power. The power of a symbol that outlives every context that originally gave it meaning and finds new contexts to inhabit across the centuries. There is a French nursery rhyme that almost every French child of the last 2 centuries has learned at some point. It begins with the words, Le bon roi Dagobert, the good King Dagobert, and proceeds through a series of comic verses describing a king who cannot dress himself properly, whose trousers are falling apart, and who requires the intervention of his advisor to manage even the most basic aspects of royal presentation. The song is satirical in origin, probably dating to the late 18th century. And its immediate political targets may have had more to do with the French monarchy of that period than with any direct memory of the 7th century king whose name it borrowed. By the modern period, his memory had been reduced in popular culture to comedy. Whatever the song's original intentions, the actual Dagobert I was the most powerful Merovingian ruler since Clovis I. He was the only king of the dynasty to reunify the entire Frankish kingdom under single rule after the divisions of the 6th century. He commanded a court at Paris that was, by the standards of the early 7th century, a genuine center of artistic production, ecclesiastical organization, and political administration. He conducted successful military campaigns across multiple frontiers. He managed diplomatic relationships with the Byzantine Empire, the Visigoth kingdom, and the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Britain. He founded and endowed religious institutions whose physical traces survive to this day. He died in 639, At an age somewhere in his 30s, after a reign of roughly a decade as king of the unified Frankish territories, Dagobert was born around 603 or 605, the son of Clotaire II, whose own long reign had ended the conflicts that Brunhild and Fredegund had set in motion. Clotaire had achieved a form of Frankish reunification through military victory, but it was the kind of reunification that depended on the personal authority of the ruler who had achieved it, rather than on structural changes that would survive his death. Dagobert's early years involved governing Austrasia, the Eastern Frankish kingdom. As a kind of apprenticeship, the Austrasian aristocracy was demanding, independent-minded, and accustomed to significant autonomy from the royal court. Managing them required a combination of military credibility, political flexibility, and the willingness to distribute patronage in ways that kept powerful families invested in the royal system rather than working against it. Dagobert managed this with a skill that his later reputation does not reflect. The sources that describe his Austrasian period, including the chronicle known as the Fredegar continuation, present a young king capable of both firmness and negotiation, who understood the limits of what royal authority could demand. When Clotaire II died in 629, Dagobert moved to consolidate control over the entire Frankish territory. His younger brother Childeric had been given control of a southwestern territory called Aquitaine. Dagobert resolved this potential division through a combination of negotiation and political pressure that resulted in Charibert's territory being absorbed into the unified kingdom after Charibert's death in 632. The reunified Frankish kingdom that Dagobert controlled from Paris was, by the standards of the early medieval world, a substantial political entity. It extended from the North Sea coast in the northwest to the Middle Rhine in the east, from the Loire Valley in the southwest to the borders of what is now Bavaria in the southeast. Its ecclesiastical organization connected it to the broader network of Catholic Christianity that was the primary cultural bond of post-Roman Western Europe, the most important figure associated with Dagobert's court, apart from the king himself, is a man named Eligius, known to later tradition as Saint Eloi, the same advisor who appears in the nursery rhyme trying to help the king with his clothing. The historical Eligius was the son of a Gallo-Roman craftsman from the region of Limoges, trained as a goldsmith, who attracted royal attention through the quality of his work and rose to become one of the most influential figures at the Merovingian court. Eligius serves as a useful illustration of something important about the Dagobert period. The court at Paris was not simply a collection of Frankish warriors gathered around a war leader in the old Germanic style. It was an institution that drew on the Gallo-Roman ecclesiastical tradition, on the artistic skills of craftsmen from across the Frankish territories, and on the administrative capabilities of men trained in the literate culture of the church. It was, in other words, a court in something approaching the fuller sense of that word. A center of governance and cultural production that reached beyond the purely military functions of early Frankish kingship. The artistic production associated with the Dagobert period is, in the assessment of modern art historians who specialize in early medieval material culture, among the finest produced anywhere in Europe in the first half of the 7th century. The goldsmithing techniques associated with the Frankish court of this period, the cloisonné work in gold and garnet, represent a tradition of considerable technical and aesthetic sophistication. The objects associated with Eligius, including reliquaries and liturgical objects commissioned for churches that Dagobert endowed, survive in sufficient number to give us a concrete sense of what the material culture of the Merovingian peak actually looked like. It did not look like barbarism. The ecclesiastical patronage of the Dagobert period extended to institutional foundation. The Abbey of Saint-Denis, located just north of Paris, received particular royal attention during Dagobert's reign. The king endowed it richly, established it as a major center of Frankish religious life, and, according to later tradition, chose it as his burial place. Saint Denis would go on to become the royal burial site of France, the resting place of French kings from the Merovingian period through the Bourbon monarchy, a continuity that connects Dagobert's choice to the last French kings buried there more than 1,000 years after his death. The diplomatic activity of the Dagobert period reflects the range of the Frankish kingdom's connections to the wider world. Dagobert maintained correspondence and conducted negotiations with the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, whose campaigns against the Sassanid Persian Empire and whose engagement with the early expansion of Islam make him a pivotal figure in the transition from late antiquity to the early medieval world. The existence of this diplomatic relationship tells us something about how the Frankish kingdom was perceived from Constantinople, which did not engage in serious diplomacy with entities it considered beneath its attention. Dagobert also maintained relationships with the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Britain, which were in the process of their own Christianization during this period, and which looked to the Frankish kingdom as a model of how a Germanic people might build a Christian political culture. So why is Dagobert not in the textbooks? The textbooks of Western European history have been built, for most of their existence, on a narrative arc that ran from the Roman Empire through the Carolingian revival to the High Medieval period and the emergence of the nation-states of modern Europe. In this narrative, the Carolingians, and specifically Charlemagne, occupy the pivotal position. They are the bridge between Rome and modernity. In this narrative, the Merovingians are a prelude, a necessary but not quite adequate predecessor to the real story. The Merovingian achievement is acknowledged, but it is acknowledged the way a foundation is acknowledged, as the thing beneath the real building. Visible only if you dig. Dagobert is the figure who most clearly demonstrates the cost of this narrative choice, because his achievement cannot easily be dismissed as a prelude. He was not building towards something else. He was building something complete. The Carolingians who came after him did not start over. They built on what he had built, while constructing accounts of the period that made what he had done harder to see clearly. Even the sources most deeply embedded in Carolingian perspective cannot quite manage to make Dagobert look like a failure. The narrative of Merovingian decline that the Carolingian tradition needed to tell conventionally begins after Dagobert. With his successors, Dagobert himself is typically acknowledged as a capable ruler, a real king, a figure whose reign represented something genuine. This acknowledgement is revealing precisely because it is clearly reluctant. A tradition that needed to paint the entire Merovingian dynasty as a progressive decline toward the lazy kingship that justified Carolingian replacement found in Dagobert, an exception it could not erase and could not quite accommodate. What it could do, and what eventually happened across the centuries that followed, was allow his memory to drift toward comedy. The trousers of the nursery rhyme remained. The kingdom was forgotten. In the year 656, a man named Grimoald made a mistake. The mistake was not in his ambition. The family to which Grimoald belonged had been building its position in the Frankish kingdoms for 2 generations by that point, accumulating the practical power of the mayorship of the palace, while the Merovingian kings retained the ceremonial authority of the throne. The direction of that trajectory was not difficult to read. The question was not whether this family would eventually seek the kingship itself. The question was when and how. Grimoald answered those questions badly. He was the mayor of the palace in Austrasia, the Eastern Frankish kingdom, and he had served in that position long enough to understand the landscape of Frankish political power with considerable precision. When the Merovingian king of Austrasia, a man named Sigebert III, died without a surviving legitimate heir, Grimoald moved. He had Sigbert's young son, a boy named Dagobert, tonsured and sent to a monastery in Ireland. He then placed his own son, a boy he had renamed Childebert, in a gesture toward Merovingian naming conventions, on the Austrasian throne. The tonsure is significant and worth pausing on. A tonsure was the ritual shaving of part of the head that marked entry into the clerical life. For a Merovingian prince, a tonsure was the functional equivalent of the hair-cutting we examined in the chapter on the long-haired kings, with an additional ecclesiastical dimension. A tonsured Merovingian was not merely symbolically stripped of his royal identity. He was formally dedicated to a life that placed him outside the political world entirely. He could not command armies. He could not make political alliances. He could not, in the framework of the Frankish political world, be a king. Sending the young Dagobert to Ireland was not random. Ireland was far enough from the Frankish territories to make his return practically difficult, close enough to the network of Irish monasteries that could absorb and contain him, and ecclesiastically connected enough to the broader church to make the arrangement seem like an act of piety rather than purely political exile. Grimoald was not simply removing a rival. He was placing that rival in a context where the very institutional framework that gave his removal meaning, the church, would ensure his continued irrelevance. The logic was sound. The execution was premature. What Grimoald had not fully accounted for was the extent to which the Merovingian blood legitimacy that he was trying to replace was still a living political force among the Frankish aristocracy. The nobles of Austrasia, and even more decisively the powers of Neustria, the Western Frankish kingdom, did not respond to the installation of Grimoald's son on the Austrasian throne as an accomplished fact to be accommodated. They responded to it as a violation of something fundamental. The Neustrian political establishment, which had its own interests in the distribution of power in the Frankish kingdoms, and which had no reason to welcome the unchecked dominance of an Austrasian family, moved against Grimoald with a speed and decisiveness that suggests the replacement of a Merovingian king with a non-Merovingian was, in 656, still understood as categorically unacceptable in ways that mere political calculation could not override. Grimoald was captured. He was taken to the Merovingian king of Neustria, and by one account was sent to Paris, where he was executed. His son Childebert, the boy he had placed on the Austrasian throne, disappeared from the historical record. The first attempt had ended with the death of its architect and the erasure of its primary instrument. What does this episode tell us? It tells us, first, that the Merovingian blood legitimacy was not merely theoretical in the mid-7th century. It was a practical political force strong enough to motivate a coalition of Frankish nobles to act against a powerful family at significant risk to themselves. The family Grimoald represented was already one of the most powerful in the Frankish world. Opposing it was not without cost. The fact that Neustrian nobles did it anyway tells us something about how seriously the principle of Merovingian legitimacy was taken. It tells us, second, that the project of replacing the Merovingians was not a sudden coup, but a multi-generational process that included failure, learned from that failure, and adjusted its strategy accordingly. The difference between Grimoald's failed attempt in 656 and Pepin the Short's successful one in 751 is not simply a matter of accumulated power. What changed was the strategy. Grimoald tried to replace the Merovingian king with a non-Merovingian without securing the ecclesiastical authorization that would have provided a substitute legitimacy. He relied on the practical power he had accumulated and the political moment that Sigebert III's death had created. And he found that practical power, however real, was not sufficient to overcome the symbolic authority of the Merovingian bloodline in the eyes of the Frankish aristocracy. Pepin the Short would not make the same mistake. When his moment came, nearly a century later, he would not move until he had something that Grimoald had not sought. He would not move until he had the Pope. There is one more element of the Grimoald episode that deserves attention before we move forward. Dagobert II, the young man sent to Ireland by Grimoald, did not simply disappear into his Irish monastery. He survived. He grew up. He maintained connections to the Frankish world through the ecclesiastical network that connected Irish monasteries to the broader church. And eventually, in 676, Approximately 20 years after his exile, he returned to Austrasia and was restored to the Austrasian throne with the support of a powerful bishop named Wilfrid of York, who had met him during his Irish period and maintained the relationship across the intervening years. Dagobert II's restoration is a remarkable episode. A prince who had been tonsured and sent to the edge of the known world as a child returned as an adult, reclaimed his throne, and reigned as king of Austrasia for several years. The tonsure that had been meant to remove him from the royal world had not, in the end, removed him. Whether this was because the political circumstances of his return were strong enough to override the symbolic disqualification, or because the tonsure had not been complete enough to fully accomplish its constitutional purpose, is a question the sources do not resolve clearly. What is clear is that Dagobert II's reign ended in assassination in 679, in circumstances that later tradition associated with figures connected to the family that would become the Carolingians. Though the evidence for this is not conclusive, he was later recognized as a martyr by the Church, a saint whose feast day is still observed in certain Catholic traditions. His life, from exile as a child to restored kingship to assassination, is one of the most extraordinary individual stories in the entire Merovingian period. It is also a story that illustrates, with unusual clarity, the central tension of a system built on blood legitimacy. The Merovingian claim was powerful enough to bring a tonsured exile back from Ireland and put him on a throne. It was not powerful enough to keep him there once the forces working against the dynasty had regrouped and refined their approach. The lesson that the family building toward Carolingian dominance drew from the events between 656 and 679 was the lesson that would define their strategy for the next 70 years. Raw power was not enough. The removal of a Merovingian from the throne was not enough if the conditions that made Merovingian legitimacy meaningful remained in place. What was required was not merely the absence of a Merovingian king, but the presence of an alternative legitimacy powerful enough to fill the space the Merovingian bloodline had occupied. The construction of that alternative legitimacy, and the patience and intelligence with which the family pursued it across 3 generations, is the subject toward which this entire account has been building. We are almost there. There is a room somewhere in the Frankish kingdom in the year 751 where a man is sitting on a throne for the last time. His name is Childeric. He is the 3rd Merovingian king to bear that name, and he will be the last Merovingian king to bear any name at all. He has been on the throne since 743. Placed there by the family that had been accumulating practical power in the Frankish kingdoms for 3 generations. He is, by every account that survives, exactly what those who placed him there needed him to be: a ceremonial figure, a man whose hair is long and whose power is not. What those accounts do not say, because they have no interest in saying it, is that his presence on that throne has been essential. For 8 years, the legitimacy of the entire Frankish political structure has rested on him. Every decision that Pepin the Short has made, as mayor of the palace, has derived its legal standing from the fact that a Merovingian king, with Merovingian hair, sat on the Merovingian throne and could be said, however fictionally, to have authorized it. What is about to happen in that room will end that arrangement. And it will end it not with a sword, not with poison, not with the kind of dynastic violence that had punctuated Merovingian history for 2.5 centuries. It will end it with an act so precisely calibrated to the symbolic grammar of the Frankish political world that it constitutes, in its way, a work of political intelligence of the highest order. It will end it with the cutting of a man's hair. To understand the full weight of what happened in 751, we need to go back approximately 2 years, to a consultation that took place not in a Frankish throne room but in a letter. Pepin the Short, who had been the dominant political force in the Frankish kingdom since the death of his father Charles Martel in 741, sent an inquiry to Pope Zachary in Rome. The inquiry, as recorded in the sources, posed a question that was simple in its formulation and profound in its implications. It asked whether it was right that kings who held no power should continue to bear the name of king, while those who actually governed remained without the royal title. The question was not really a question. It was a request for authorization, framed in terms that made the authorization seem like a logical conclusion to an obvious problem. Pepin was not asking the Pope to tell him something he did not already know. He was asking the Pope to say something publicly, in his capacity as the institutional representative of Catholic authority, that would provide the legitimacy for what Pepin had already decided to do. Pope Zachary's response affirmed the principle that those who exercised power should hold the title appropriate to that power. It is better, the response conveyed, that the man who has the power should be called king, than that the man who is called king should have no power. With that response in hand, Pepin moved. An assembly of Frankish nobles and ecclesiastical figures was convened. At that assembly, Pepin was acclaimed as king of the Franks. The acclamation was followed by an anointing, performed by the bishops present, and later confirmed by Pope Stephen II in person, who traveled to the Frankish kingdom specifically to perform the anointing and to secure Carolingian military support for papal interests in Italy. The anointing was not a trivial ceremony. It was a deliberate and carefully chosen substitute for the blood legitimacy that the Carolingians could not claim. In the Old Testament tradition that the Catholic Church drew on for its understanding of sacred kingship, the anointing of a king was the act by which divine authorization passed into human political form. Samuel had anointed Saul. Samuel had anointed David. By accepting the papal anointing, Pepin was accepting a particular theory of where royal legitimacy came from. It came not from blood, not from the body, not from the inherited quality that resided in Merovingian hair and Merovingian flesh. It came from the Church, acting as the institutional representative of divine will. This was a different theory of kingship from the one the Merovingians had embodied. It was a theory that, crucially, the Carolingians could access, and the Merovingians could not replicate in reverse. The Merovingians could not anoint themselves into Carolingian legitimacy, but the Carolingians could anoint themselves out of the need for Merovingian blood. The construction was elegant. It was also, in its way, as much a myth as the Quinotaur. The claim that God had chosen Pepin, expressed through the institutional authority of the papacy, was not a verifiable historical fact any more than the claim that Merovech had been fathered by a sea creature. It was a story about the source of legitimacy, told in the language available to the political culture that needed to tell it. But the story worked. It worked because the institution that told it commanded a kind of authority in the Frankish world that no Frankish family could match. And it worked because the alternative, the Merovingian blood legitimacy, was about to be visibly and publicly dismantled. Now we return to that room, and to Childeric III. Childeric was taken from his throne. The sources are not specific about the physical details of what followed, and we should be careful not to reach beyond what the evidence supports. What the sources do tell us is that Childeric was tonsured, that his long hair, the hair that had been the visible mark of his royal identity and the constitutional symbol of his dynasty's claim to rule, was cut. Think about what this moment meant in the symbolic grammar of the Frankish world. For nearly 300 years, the long hair of the Merovingian kings had been the visible sign of a legitimacy that resided in the blood and expressed itself through the body. The hair said this person carries something that cannot be manufactured, cannot be transferred, cannot be taken away. The hair said this person is different from other people in a way that is physically present and visible and real. The cutting of Childeric's hair said the opposite of all of that. It said whatever was in the blood is no longer being expressed. Whatever made this man a king, in the terms that this political world has recognized for 3 centuries, is being publicly and formally overridden, not destroyed, because you cannot destroy what is in the blood, but overridden, replaced by a different account of where legitimacy comes from. The people who cut Childeric's hair had learned the symbolic grammar from the Merovingians themselves. They had watched, across 3 generations of power accumulation, how the Merovingians had used hair cutting as a political instrument, how they had reduced rivals to irrelevance with a pair of scissors rather than a sword, how the symbol could accomplish what violence left incomplete, because violence could be reversed, but symbolic destruction had a finality that physical force alone could not achieve. They had learned the lesson. They applied it to the people who had taught it. Childeric was placed in a monastery. He had a son named Theodoric, who was also, by most accounts, placed in a monastery. The Merovingian bloodline did not end in 751 in a biological sense. It continued in religious seclusion, maintained in a condition of physical safety that was also a condition of complete political irrelevance. A living Merovingian was not a threat as long as he was in a monastery with his hair cut. A dead Merovingian was a martyr, a possible rallying point for resistance. The new order had learned enough Merovingian history to understand that distinction. What ended in 751 was not the bloodline. What ended was the political world that had made the bloodline meaningful. The Merovingian political order had been built on a set of ideas about where legitimacy came from. Ideas expressed through the bodies of kings, through their hair, through the myth of their supernatural origin, through the accumulated weight of 3 centuries, during which those ideas had organized the political life of the Frankish world. That political order did not end because it had failed on its own terms. It ended because the Carolingians had built, with patience and intelligence, and the crucial partnership of the papacy, an alternative political order with its own theory of legitimacy, its own institutional support, and its own capacity to make the Frankish aristocracy feel that its interests were being served. The transition from blood legitimacy to ecclesiastical legitimacy was one of the most consequential political transformations of the early medieval period. It established the template for the relationship between royal and religious authority that would define the political culture of Western Europe for centuries. The conflicts between popes and emperors that shaped medieval European politics in the 11th and 12th centuries were, in a fundamental sense, consequences of the arrangement created in 751, when a pope told a mayor of the palace that the man with the power should have the name, and a pair of scissors ended 300 years of Merovingian rule. Childeric III lived out his remaining years in his monastery. The sources are uncertain about the date of his death. He left no political legacy that the surviving record acknowledges. He left no writings. He left no monuments. What he left was the fact of what was done to his hair, and what that doing meant in the world he had lived in. It tells us that the people who did it took the system they were dismantling seriously enough to dismantle it on its own terms, using its own symbolic vocabulary, rather than simply removing the last king and moving on. They cut the hair. They sent the king to the monastery. They had the pope anoint their candidate in a ceremony that rewrote the language of royal legitimacy in the Frankish world. And then they set about constructing a version of history that would make what they had done seem not like the deliberate dismantling of a functioning political order, but like the necessary conclusion of a long and inevitable decline. That construction, and the questions it raises about history and memory and the power of those who control the archive, is what this account has been examining from its beginning. And it is time now to look at what happened when that construction was picked up, centuries later, by a tradition that took the gaps and silences in the Merovingian record and filled them with something very different from what anyone in the 8th century had intended. London, 1982. 3 men are sitting with a manuscript that has taken them years to research. Their names are Michael Begant, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln. The book they have written will sell millions of copies, generate lawsuits, and attach itself to the name of the Merovingian dynasty more durably than any work of serious scholarship produced in the same period. The book is called The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. Its central argument is that Jesus of Nazareth survived the crucifixion, married Mary Magdalene, and produced children whose bloodline eventually passed into the Merovingian dynasty of the Frankish kingdoms. This bloodline, the argument continues, has been protected across the centuries by a secret society called the Priory of Sion, which counted among its Grand Masters figures including Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, and Victor Hugo. The book was presented not as fiction but as research. It deployed footnotes, cited documents, named archives, and constructed its argument in the formal language of historical inquiry. It was also, in the assessment of every serious historian of the medieval period who examined its claims, built on a foundation of fabricated documents, misread sources, and logical connections that the evidence did not support. Understanding why this matters, for any honest account of the Merovingians, requires separating three distinct things that the book and its successors collapsed together. The first is the historical Merovingian dynasty, which we have been examining throughout this account. Real kings, documented in real sources, operating in a real political world, whose outlines we can reconstruct with reasonable confidence from the surviving evidence. The second is the genuine historical interest of the Merovingian period, which is substantial and which requires no embellishment to be compelling. The questions of how the Merovingians built their legitimacy, why they were displaced, what their relationship to the church and to the family that replaced them actually looked like, and what they left behind when they were gone, are genuinely interesting historical questions whose answers illuminate something real about the world we live in. The third is the modern mythological tradition that has accumulated around the Merovingians since the late 20th century, which includes the bloodline thesis, the Priory of Sion, the Mary Magdalene connection, and the various elaborations that have followed in the wake of the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail and, more recently, of Dan Brown's novel The Da Vinci Code, published in 2003. These three things are not the same. Treating them as continuous is how accounts of the Merovingians go most seriously wrong. The Priory of Sion, presented in The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail as an organization with roots in the medieval period, is a real organization, but its reality is very different from what the book claimed. It was founded in 1956 in the town of Annemasse in eastern France by a man named Pierre Plantard. It was registered as a French association in accordance with French law, and its stated purpose at the time of its founding had nothing to do with ancient bloodlines or medieval secret knowledge. It was a local organization concerned with civic matters in the town where it was founded. The documents that connected the Priory of Sion to medieval history, documents that Bagent, Lee, and Lincoln used as primary evidence for their argument, were deposited in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris in the 1960s and early 1970s. They purported to be medieval records demonstrating the organization's ancient lineage and its connection to the Merovingian dynasty and to the bloodline of Jesus. These documents were fabrications, not medieval documents that had been misinterpreted, not genuine historical sources that enthusiastic researchers read too creatively. Fabrications, created in the 20th century and deposited in a national archive in order to be later cited as evidence for claims their creator wished to make. The exposure of this fabrication is documented and traceable. French investigative journalist Jean-Luc Chaumail began publishing research on the origins of the documents in the 1970s. The researchers Henry Lincoln had drawn on for his initial work had their own disputes with Plantard that led to partial exposure of the fabrication from the inside. And according to court records from a French judicial investigation in 1993, Pierre Plantard admitted before an examining magistrate that the documents he had deposited in the Bibliothèque Nationale were modern fabrications, and that the claims about the Priory of Sion's medieval origins were invented. This admission is cited in the research of Massimo Introvigne, the Italian sociologist of religion whose work on esoteric traditions has examined the Priory of Sion phenomenon in careful detail. And in the work of Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince, whose book The Sion Revelation, published in 2006, traced the history of the fabrication with particular thoroughness. The question that matters here is not whether the documents were fabricated. That is established. The question worth spending time on is why the fabrication worked as well as it did. Why it was accepted by researchers who were trying to do serious work. Why it generated a publishing phenomenon that outlasted the exposure of its central documents. And what that tells us about the relationship between historical mystery and cultural need. The answer begins with the genuine gap that the Merovingian record presents. The Merovingians were, as we have established throughout this account, a dynasty that was systematically reframed in historical memory by the tradition that replaced them. The documentary record of the early Merovingian period is thin. The later Merovingian period is documented primarily through sources produced by or for their successors. The myths and legends that surrounded the dynasty in their own time were preserved in fragments, in chronicles of uncertain reliability, in traditions whose origins are difficult to trace. This genuine thinness of the record is not a deliberate suppression. It is the ordinary consequence of time, of the destruction of documents, of the control of the archive by Carolingian institutions, and of the simple fact that the early medieval period produced fewer written records than the periods that preceded and followed it. But thinness of record looks, to a certain kind of reader, like concealment. Gaps in the historical record look, to a certain kind of reader, like deliberate management. And deliberate management implies a reason for the management, which implies something worth managing, which implies a secret. The Priory of Sion documents arrived in this environment of genuine historical gap and genuine historical interest and presented themselves as the key to the locked room. They claimed to explain what the gap concealed. They were, in that sense, doing something deeply human, filling a void with meaning, taking the genuine mystery of a dynasty that had been pushed into the background of history and providing an answer that was larger and stranger and more satisfying than the actual historical record could supply. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, published 21 years after The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, and drawing extensively on its argument, brought the Merovingian bloodline thesis to tens of millions of readers who had never heard of Pierre Plantard or the Bibliothèque Nationale or the details of medieval Frankish political history. For most of those readers, the name Merovingian entered their consciousness, attached to the claim about sacred bloodlines, not attached to the history of a dynasty that had actually existed and actually built something significant in the post-Roman world. This is the clearest illustration of what the modern mythological tradition has cost the Merovingians. It has not simply added a layer of confusion to the historical record. It has, for the majority of people who encounter the name Merovingian in contemporary culture, replaced the historical record entirely. The actual dynasty, with its genuine political achievement and its genuine historical complexity, has been buried under a story that is more dramatically satisfying and more completely disconnected from the evidence than even the Carolingian reshaping of the 8th century managed to achieve. The Carolingians reframed the Merovingians as a failed prelude. The late 20th century tradition replaced them with characters in a story about bloodlines and secret societies and the hidden architecture of Western civilization. What remains, beneath both layers, is what we have been examining throughout this account. A dynasty that built something real, that solved real political problems with genuine intelligence, That created the institutional and symbolic framework within which the political culture of Western Europe developed. And that was pushed into the background not because it failed, but because it was replaced by people who had studied it carefully enough to dismantle it on its own terms. That dynasty deserves to be known for what it was. In the summer of 1959, an archaeological team working in the northern French town of Saint-Denis made a discovery beneath the floor of the basilica that had been accumulating the dead of French royal tradition for 1,500 years. They found a skeleton. The burial was consistent in its characteristics, with a high-status Merovingian interment of the 7th century. The grave goods were modest by the standards of the richest Merovingian burials. But the location, beneath the floor of the church that Dagobert I had endowed as his royal burial place, and the characteristics of the burial assemblage, pointed to someone from within the Merovingian royal orbit. Later analysis suggested the remains might be associated with a member of the royal family. Though the identification remained cautious, the find was not dramatic in the way that Childeric's tomb had been dramatic. There were no golden bees, no engraved ring, no spectacular jeweled weapons. But it was in some ways more significant than a dramatic find would have been, because it confirmed something that the written sources alone could not fully establish: that Saint-Denis had been a Merovingian royal burial site from its earliest period, and that the tradition of French royal burial there, which would continue for more than 1,000 years, had its roots in a deliberate Merovingian decision to make this particular place the resting ground of the dynasty. This is the kind of thing that archaeological work does for the Merovingian period that no written source can replicate. It provides independent evidence not produced by the institutional interests that shaped the written record. For the realities of Merovingian life and death, Patrick Perrin, who served for many years as the director of the Musée d'Archéologie Nationale at Saint-Germain-en-Laye outside Paris, has been one of the central figures in the archaeological study of the Merovingian period for several decades. His work, and the work of the researchers associated with him, has built a picture of the Merovingian world that is in significant respects more complex and more impressive than the written sources alone would suggest. The craft production of the Merovingian period, and particularly the metalwork associated with Frankish aristocratic culture, represents one of the most technically sophisticated traditions in early medieval Western Europe, the cloisonné technique, in which thin strips of gold are bent into compartments and filled with cut garnets or colored glass to create intricate polychrome designs, was practiced at a level of refinement in the Frankish world of the 5th and 6th centuries that was among the finest in contemporary Western Europe, comparable in technical ambition to the best work being produced in the Anglo-Saxon, Ostrogothic, and Lombard traditions of the same period. The fibulae, the decorative clasps used to fasten cloaks and garments, found in Merovingian aristocratic burials across the territory of the former Frankish kingdoms, are among the most technically accomplished small objects produced anywhere in the post-Roman world. The best examples demonstrate a command of materials and technique that required years of specialized training and access to materials sourced from extraordinary distances. This point about materials deserves particular attention. The garnets in Merovingian metalwork did not come from Europe. The analysis of their geological and chemical signatures, conducted by researchers including those associated with the Germanen Project in Germany, has traced their origins to mines in what is now Sri Lanka and possibly other parts of South Asia. The amber found in some Merovingian burials came from the Baltic. The ivory, sometimes incorporated into Merovingian luxury objects, came from Africa. The Frankish kingdom of the 6th and 7th centuries was not an isolated enclave cut off from the wider world by the collapse of Rome. It was connected, through chains of exchange that spanned the known world, to the broader networks of the early medieval Eurasian economy. The garnet that ended up in a cloak clasp in a grave in northern France had traveled further to reach its destination than most people alive in that century would travel in a lifetime. The burial evidence that forms the core of Merovingian archaeological knowledge comes from thousands of excavated graves distributed across the territory of the former Frankish kingdoms, concentrated particularly in northern France, Belgium, western Germany, and the Rhineland. This funerary archaeology provides information that no written source can supply. It provides information about diet. Through the analysis of skeletal remains and stable isotopes, the evidence suggests a population that was reasonably well nourished by the standards of the period, with access to a varied diet that included significant quantities of animal protein. It provides information about social hierarchy. Through the differential distribution of grave goods, it provides information about gender and age. Through the study of burial assemblages in relation to the biological characteristics of the individuals interred, the grave goods associated with women in Merovingian burials reflect a world in which women of aristocratic status had access to significant personal wealth expressed through jewelry, textile, and personal ornaments of considerable quality. The weapons assemblages in male aristocratic burials tell us something about the military culture of the Frankish world that the written sources confirm but cannot fully convey. The swords found in Merovingian elite burials are not crude iron tools. They are sophisticated weapons, pattern-welded through a labor-intensive process that produced blades of exceptional quality, often with hilts decorated in the same cloisonné technique used for other high-status metalwork. The evidence from settlement archaeology, though more difficult to recover than burial evidence, adds further dimensions to this picture. The cities that the Roman world had built did not simply empty out and fall to ruin after the 5th century. Many of them continued as centers of population and economic activity, reduced from their Roman peak but not abandoned, maintained partly through the ecclesiastical institutions that were embedded in them and that provided continuity of function even as the political structures around them transformed. What the site of Rennes-le-Château in the south of France shows us, by contrast, is what happens when the gap between the actual archaeological record and the desired mythological narrative becomes too wide to bridge. Honestly, the legitimate archaeological work conducted in and around Rennes-le-Château has not produced evidence of a Merovingian presence of unusual historical significance. The connection between the site and the Merovingian dynasty, as elaborated in the literature descending from the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, depended entirely on the fabricated documents that were later exposed as modern inventions. The most careful historical investigation of the site, represented in the research published by Bill Putnam and John Edwin Wood in 2003, found that the most plausible explanation for the sudden wealth of the village's 19th-century priest was the irregular sale of masses rather than the discovery of royal treasure or secret documents. The site is historically interesting for what it reveals about late 19th-century French rural Catholicism and about the mechanisms by which local legends attach themselves to larger mythological frameworks. It does not add anything to what we know about the actual Merovingian dynasty. What the archaeological record of the actual Merovingian world reveals, taken as a whole, is a civilization that deserves to be understood on its own terms, not as a prelude to something else, not as a barbaric interlude between Roman sophistication and Carolingian revival, not as the vehicle for a sacred bloodline that has no basis in the evidence, as a genuine historical achievement built by real people, in a real world, that shaped the subsequent history of a continent in ways that the earth has been more faithful to preserving than the written tradition. The Abbey of Corbie, situated in the Somme Valley of what is now northern France, was founded in the 660s under Merovingian royal patronage. Within a century of its foundation, its scriptorium had become one of the most productive centers of manuscript production in the Frankish world. The writing system developed by the scribes at Corbie in the late 7th and early 8th centuries a clear and consistent script that made manuscripts easier to produce and easier to read, was one of the direct ancestors of the Carolingian minuscule that would standardize manuscript production across the Frankish world in the 9th century. The Carolingian minuscule is the ancestor of the typeface you are reading now. The connection runs through Corby, and Corby was a Merovingian foundation. This small example of documentary inheritance illustrates the central paradox of the Merovingian legacy. The dynasty that the Carolingians worked to reframe in historical memory was the dynasty on whose institutional foundations the Carolingian achievement was built. The Carolingians did not replace the Merovingians by starting over. They replaced them by taking over, inheriting the structures the Merovingians had built, and then presenting those structures as their own creation, while writing the Merovingian builders into the background of the story. The most significant Merovingian institutional legacy is the network of monasteries and ecclesiastical institutions founded, endowed, and developed under Merovingian royal patronage across the 2.5 centuries of the dynasty's rule. The monastic tradition in the Frankish kingdoms grew dramatically during the Merovingian period, partly through the influence of Irish and British missionaries whose spiritually intense and textually sophisticated version of Christianity made a deep impression on the Frankish church, and partly through the deliberate royal patronage that gave monasteries the land, resources, and legal protection they needed to establish themselves as permanent institutions. The great monasteries of the Frankish world, including Luxeuil, founded in the late 6th century under the influence of the Irish missionary Columbanus, Saint-Denis, north of Paris, Corby in the Somme Valley, and Stavelot-Malmedy in the Ardennes, were Merovingian foundations or received their most significant early development under Merovingian patronage. These monasteries were not simply places of prayer. They were the primary institutions of learning and literacy in the Frankish world. They maintained libraries, trained scribes, preserved texts, and educated the children of aristocratic families who would go on to staff both the ecclesiastical and the secular administrative apparatus of the kingdoms. The intellectual culture of the Carolingian period, the revival of learning and manuscript production associated with the court of Charlemagne, was built on a monastic infrastructure that the Merovingians had created. When Charlemagne wanted educated men to staff his court and reform the Frankish church, he drew on monasteries. When he wanted manuscripts to copy and texts to study, he drew on monastic libraries. The availability of those monasteries and those libraries in the late 8th century was a consequence of the patronage and the institutional development of the Merovingian period. The ecclesiastical organization of the Frankish church, as it existed in the Carolingian period, was also substantially Merovingian in its basic structure. The network of bishoprics, the relationships between episcopal sees, the legal frameworks within which church property was held and church courts operated. All of these had been developed, negotiated, and elaborated during the Merovingian centuries. The councils of the Merovingian church established precedents and canonical regulations that the Carolingian church built on rather than replaced, usually without attribution to their Merovingian origins. The administrative geography of the Carolingian kingdom was also substantially inherited from the Merovingian period. The pagi, the administrative districts that organized local governance, the system of counts who administered these districts as royal agents, the relationship between central royal authority and local administrative structures, all of these had Merovingian antecedents that the Carolingian system elaborated rather than invented. The concept of the Frankish kingdom as a unified political entity, governed by a single dynasty that held its authority as a sacred trust, expressed through a combination of military power, ecclesiastical partnership, and symbolic legitimacy, was a Merovingian concept. The Carolingians inherited this concept along with the territory and the institutions. What they changed was the theory of where the dynasty's sacred authority came from, replacing blood with anointing, replacing supernatural origin with papal endorsement. The language itself reflects the Merovingian foundation. The word France derives from the medieval Latin Francia, the land of the Franks. The Franks were a category that a Roman administrative system had applied to a collection of Germanic groups along the Rhine frontier. The Merovingians were the family that took this administrative category and transformed it into a political identity, building the institutions and establishing the cultural patterns that made being Frankish mean something more than simply living in a particular territory. The identity that the Merovingians created outlasted them by more than a millennium. The political and cultural space called France, in whatever form it has taken across the centuries, traces its name to the people whose identity the Merovingians built, not to the people who replaced them. The Salic law, the legal code associated with the Salian Franks and preserved in texts from the Merovingian period, is one of the most important documents in the history of early medieval European law. It regulated property, inheritance, violence, and social relations among the Frankish people and the populations who lived among them. Its provisions were not static. They were elaborated and amended across the Merovingian period as the kingdoms grew and the populations they governed became more diverse. The existence of the Salic law as a codified legal tradition represents something genuine about Merovingian political culture, a concern with establishing written rules for social organization that went beyond the purely customary law of the early Germanic world. There is something worth sitting with here, before this account moves toward its conclusion. The tradition that did the most to push the Merovingians into the background of historical memory was the tradition that owed the most to what the Merovingians had built. The Carolingians needed the Merovingian institutional world to be real and functional, to provide the infrastructure on which the Carolingian achievement could be built. But they could not fully acknowledge the debt, because acknowledging the debt would have complicated the legitimacy narrative they were constructing. This is a mechanism that runs through political transitions in every period. Successor regimes need to claim continuity, because continuity legitimizes their inheritance of the predecessor's territory and institutions. But they also need to claim discontinuity, because discontinuity legitimizes their replacement of the predecessor. Managing both claims simultaneously requires a selective relationship with historical truth, preserving what serves the narrative of legitimate succession and pushing into the background what complicates the narrative of necessary replacement. The Merovingians built something. It lasted. The people who came after them lived in it, administered it, prayed in its churches, studied in its monasteries, governed through its administrative structures, and called themselves by the name the Merovingians had given to the political identity they had created. That is a legacy, not the cosmic legacy of a divine bloodline, not the modest legacy of a failed dynasty that paved the way for something better. A real legacy, built by real people, in a real world, that shaped the history of a continent in ways that continue to be present in the institutions and identities of the Europe that exists today. In the spring of 1816, a French scholar named Jean-Baptiste Serreux d'Agincourt published the final volumes of a massive work on the history of art from the late Roman period through the medieval centuries. In assembling his account of early medieval artistic production, he found himself confronted with a problem that he named directly in his text. The sources for the Merovingian period were thin, hostile, and almost entirely produced by the tradition that had replaced the dynasty he was trying to understand. He noted the problem. He noted that it made his task harder, and then he worked with what he had, carefully, noting where the evidence was thin and where it was more substantial. This is the beginning of serious historical practice with the Merovingians, acknowledging what the sources are, where they come from, and what they cannot tell us. and then working carefully within those limits. It is also, it turns out, a practice with implications that go far beyond the specific question of the Merovingian dynasty. The Merovingians were, as this account has tried to establish, pushed into the background of historical memory not because they failed, but because they were replaced by people who controlled the institutions that produced and preserved historical records. The Carolingian reshaping of Merovingian memory was not a conspiracy in any dramatic sense. It was the ordinary operation of political power in a world where writing and record-keeping were concentrated in institutions that depended on royal patronage. The effect was nonetheless real. A dynasty that had built the institutional foundations of medieval Western Europe was reframed as a prelude, a necessary but inadequate predecessor to the real story, which began with the people who had replaced them. This reframing had a real historical distortion at its center, not the divine bloodline that the modern mythological tradition imagined, but the distortion that scholarship has spent the last century working to correct the gap between what the Merovingians actually built and what the sources produced by their successors were willing to credit them with having built. Understanding this distortion, and understanding how it was produced and how it has been corrected, is the practice of critical historical reading. It is the practice of approaching every source with the question, who made this? For what purpose? In what context? And what did they need it to say? Gregory of Tours was not dishonest when he wrote his History of the Franks. He was writing from inside a world whose assumptions he could not fully step outside of, in the service of a church whose interests shaped what he found significant and what he found negligible. The Carolingian annalists were not fabricating when they described the later Merovingian kings as ceremonial figures without real power. They were describing a reality that 3 generations of careful political maneuvering had worked very hard to create, and then presenting that created reality as if it were a natural condition rather than a constructed one. The modern mythological tradition, in its way, was also responding to something real, the sense that the official story left something out, that the Merovingians had been pushed into the background in ways that suggested there was something being managed in historical memory. Was not wrong. There was a real historical distortion, but the explanation the modern mythological tradition provided for that distortion, the divine bloodline, the secret society, the hidden architecture of Western civilization, was not the distortion that scholarship had identified. It was a different story entirely, one that served the needs of a late 20th century readership for cosmic significance, rather than the needs of anyone trying to understand what actually happened in the Frankish kingdoms of the 5th through 8th centuries. The gap between those two things, between the real historical distortion and the imagined cosmic secret, is itself a useful thing to understand. It tells us something about how human beings respond to the sense that the official account is incomplete. We do not, as a general rule, respond by demanding more careful source criticism. We respond by reaching for a story large enough to fill the space that the incomplete account has left open. This response is not irrational. It is deeply human, and it is worth naming honestly, rather than simply condemning, because the impulse it expresses, the sense that there is more to the story than we are being told, is sometimes correct. In the case of the Merovingians, the sense was correct. There was more to the story. The more, however, was not a divine bloodline. It was the institutional achievement of a dynasty whose actual significance had been systematically minimized by the tradition that replaced it, and then buried under the cosmic elaborations of a tradition that found cosmic significance. More satisfying than careful historical reconstruction, the Merovingian story matters beyond its own specific content because the mechanism it illustrates is not historical. It is present. The management of historical memory by those who control the institutions that produce and preserve it is an ongoing feature of how societies organize their relationship to the past. The question of who controls the narrative of how we arrived, where we are, and whose achievements are emphasized and whose are pushed into the background, and how the gaps in the official story are explained, and whether those explanations serve the interests of those who provide them, is a question with immediate and practical stakes for anyone who lives inside a political culture. The distance between what happened and what was recorded, between the institutional achievement of the Merovingian dynasty and the thin, hostile, retrospective sources through which we know it, is where the real understanding of this period begins. It is also where a habit of mind begins, a habit of asking about any account of any past that matters. Who made this? And why? And what it needed to say? And what it therefore could not afford to notice? That habit is the most durable thing the Merovingian story can offer. Not the bees. Not the long hair. Not the quinator. Not Pierre Plantard's fabricated documents. The habit of reading the past with the kind of careful, honest attention that the evidence requires, and that the Merovingians, in the end, have always deserved. Paris, 1804. A man stands in the Cathedral of Notre Dame and places a crown on his own head, refusing to allow the Pope, who has traveled from Rome specifically to perform the coronation, to complete the one act that would have made the Pope, rather than the man himself. The source of the authority being claimed, his name is Napoleon Bonaparte. He has no connection by blood to any royal dynasty of France or of Europe. He has risen to power through military intelligence, political skill, and a capacity for the management of symbols and stories that rivals anything produced in the political culture of the early medieval world he had studied so carefully. On his imperial mantle, worked into the fabric in gold, are bees, the same bees, or rather the descendants of the same symbolic tradition that had been found in the grave of Childeric I in Tournai in 1653. The same bees that a goldsmith had sewn into the fabric of a royal burial garment 1400 years before Napoleon stood in Notre Dame. The same bees that connected a 5th century Frankish king to a 19th century French emperor across the entire span of European history that separated them. Napoleon chose those bees deliberately. He chose them because he understood what they said. They said, "My authority reaches back to the deepest roots of the political tradition I am claiming." They said, "I am not the successor of the Bourbons, not the restorer of a monarchy that the revolution had interrupted. I am something older and something different. A new kind of power with ancient foundations. What the bees could not say, what no symbol can say, is whether the claim was true." Napoleon had no Merovingian blood. He had studied the objects in the Cabinet des Médailles and recognized in them a symbolic vocabulary that could serve his needs. And he had appropriated that vocabulary with the same intelligence he brought to everything else he did. The Merovingians had not authorized Napoleon. The bees had simply survived long enough to become available for appropriation by someone who needed what they represented. This is the final pattern that runs through the entire history of the Merovingian legacy. It is the pattern this account has been circling toward from its beginning. The Merovingians built their legitimacy on things designed to be permanent. The supernatural blood that came from the sea creature could not be manufactured or transferred. The long hair that expressed that blood's presence was always visible and always verifiable. The myth of the dynasty's origin was constructed to be immune to challenge, because it operated in a register that human challenge could not reach. They built these things to last. And in a sense, they did last. But they lasted in a form the Merovingians had not anticipated and could not have controlled. Stripped of their original context, available for appropriation by people with entirely different agendas and entirely different claims to the authority the symbols had originally expressed. The quinator of Fredegar's chronicle became, in the modern mythological tradition, evidence of a divine bloodline with no connection to anything Fredegar had understood or intended. The long hair of the long-haired kings became, in certain strands of romantic historiography, evidence of a noble essence that had been suppressed by Roman Christianity. The golden bees of Childeric's tomb became Napoleon's imperial symbol, then a curiosity in the mythology of Napoleonic self-presentation, then a reference point in the modern tradition connecting the Merovingians to secret historical continuities. None of these subsequent appropriations preserved what the originals had meant. All of them used what the originals had expressed: the sense of depth, of rootedness, of connection to something older and more powerful than the immediate present, for purposes that the Merovingians would not have recognized. This is what myths do when they are strong enough to outlive the contexts that made them. They do not die. They transform. They attach themselves to new contexts, new needs, new frameworks of meaning, and they carry within those new contexts something of the energy that made them powerful in their original form, while losing the specific content that the original form had carried. The Merovingian myths were strong. They were strong because they addressed something fundamental about the human relationship to authority. The need to believe that the people who hold power over us hold it for reasons that go beyond the merely contingent, the merely military, the merely accidental. The belief that a ruler's blood carries something that cannot be manufactured. That the legitimacy of a dynasty is not just a political arrangement but an expression of something deeper and more permanent, is a belief that does not require the medieval world to make sense. It requires only the human world, which has always needed to believe that the arrangements of power are more than arrangements. The Carolingians replaced one expression of this belief with another. The papal anointing that legitimized Pepin the Short was no less a claim to sanction beyond the merely human than the Merovingian bloodline it replaced. It simply located that sanction in a different institution. The underlying human need that both claims addressed was identical. The modern mythological tradition located the sanction somewhere else again, in a bloodline that reached back not merely to a sea creature, but to the figure who stands at the center of the Western religious imagination. The claim was extravagant beyond anything the Merovingians had attempted. But the structure of the claim, the idea that a particular group of people carried in their blood a connection to the sacred that ordinary human arrangements could not replicate or replace, was structurally continuous with what Fredegar had written about Merovech and the sea. Napoleon did not make a supernatural claim for his bees. He was too much the product of the Enlightenment that had dissolved the old frameworks of divine kingship for that. But he made an historical claim, which in the modern world serves many of the same functions that supernatural claims served in the medieval world. The claim to deep historical roots, to a connection with the foundational moments of a political tradition, is the secular, modern version of the sacred genealogy that political cultures have constructed for themselves throughout recorded history. The Merovingians are at those roots, not because Pierre Plantard put them there in fabricated documents, not because the modern mythological tradition needed them there to support its cosmic narrative, but because they were actually there, in the forests and river valleys of post-Roman Gaul, building something that lasted long enough and mattered enough that even the most determined efforts to push their memory into the background could not entirely succeed. The last Merovingian king had his hair cut in 751. The dynasty was over. But the myths they had built, the bees and the long hair and the sea creature and the blood that could not be manufactured, those were not over. They are still running. They will keep running, in whatever form the next century finds useful for them. Long after this account has been read and set aside, and the specific questions it has tried to address have been addressed again, differently, by someone else, in a world that is different from ours, in ways we cannot predict, but continuous with ours, in the ways that matter. The long-haired kings are gone, what they built, and what they meant, and the questions their story raises about power and memory and who gets to decide what we remember. Those are not gone. They are underneath everything. Still, there, still waiting for the kind of attention that the evidence has always been capable of rewarding. This has been the story of the Merovingians. Thank you for spending this night with it.